On their website, stated clearly says that, in part, their mission is to promote the art of critical thinking by exposing people from all walks of life to the simple beauty of science. However, I think a case can be made that stated clearly is actually in the business of promoting questionable philosophical ideas under the guise of teaching science. Specifically, I think stated clearly is actually advocating for philosophical naturalism. I think that the error that stated clearly makes, along with many in the scientific community, is that they confuse the principle of methodological naturalism with philosophical naturalism. Philosophical naturalism believes that the physical world is all that exists. Methodological naturalism says that scientific research should only seek answers that have natural causes. Philosophical naturalism has no convincing positive logical arguments supporting it. Most of the arguments for naturalism are actually arguments against theism, and most of those arguments make the unwarranted assumption that if God exists, he would not have sufficient reasons to create the universe as it appears to be. But it is impossible for philosophy to prove these assertions. Furthermore, sometimes observations in the natural world do not lend themselves to purely naturalistic explanations. Based on the underlying premise of methodological naturalism, that is the basis of scientific discovery, this is where science should stop. To go further with natural explanations when the data we encounter does not lend itself to a naturalistic explanation crosses the line from science into philosophy and the flawed conclusion of philosophical naturalism at that. Just as religious principles should not be discussed in science classes, neither should highly questionable philosophical principles be taught either. This is the mistake that stated clearly makes when it discusses origin of life research. If one is promoting the art of critical thinking, it seems unlikely that one would advocate for naturalistic explanations for the origin of life. When it comes to the origins of life, scientists are largely in agreement. Science cannot explain the origins of life by natural causes or by any other means. To make matters worse, stated clearly has devoted 4 videos to origin of life questions. The videos are: Can science explain the origin of life? What is chemical evolution? What was the Miller-Urey experiment? What is the RNA world hypothesis? So here's the thing. Even atheist Richard Dawkins admits that science cannot explain the origins of life, as can be observed in the following video clip.
Nobody knows how it started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
What was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right, and how did that happen?
I told you we don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
No, nor has anybody.
Nor has anyone else.
James Tour is one of the world's leading synthetic chemists. He also happens to be a Christian, and he has been very vocal in his skepticism of origin of life research. In this clip, James Tour assesses current origin of life research and concludes that science basically knows nothing about how life arose under prebiotic conditions on the early Earth.
Those that say, oh, this is well worked out, they know nothing about chemical synthesis. Nothing. Further cluelessness. From a synthetic chemical perspective, neither I nor any of my colleagues can fathom a prebiotic molecular route to construction of a complex system. We cannot figure out the prebiotic routes to the basic building blocks of life: carbohydrates, nucleic acids, lipids, and proteins. Chemists are collectively bewildered. Hence, I say that no chemist understands prebiotic synthesis of the requisite building blocks, let alone their assembly into a complex system. That's how clueless we are. I've asked all of my colleagues, National Academy members, Nobel Prize winners. I sit with them in offices. Nobody understands this. So if your professors say it's all worked out, your teachers say it's all worked out, they don't know what they're talking about. It is not worked out.
To give you an idea of what James Tour and his team are capable of achieving, here's a video of a rat that has had its spinal cord severed and then repaired using graphene nanoribbons developed by Tour and his team. You can still see the scar from the surgery at the base of the rat's skull. James Tour and his team used graphene nanoribbons to repair the severed spinal cord, and after only 2 weeks before the surgery scar had even had time to heal, the rat is already walking around. James Tour knows firsthand how difficult it is to synthesize complex chemical compounds, probably better than most chemists today, and certainly better than anyone associated with the Stated Clearly website. So I think we should give his conclusions about the state of origin of life research considerable weight, especially since his assessment largely agrees with the conclusions of Richard Dawkins. Now we'll look at a brief summary of some of the problems with the origin of life videos produced by Stated Clearly. In their video titled, "Can Science Explain the Origin of Life?" they make the specious claim that some molecules can form polymers and this somehow is analogous to DNA. This is an utterly ridiculous assumption. In their video titled, "What is Chemical Evolution?" Stated Clearly claims that so-called self-assembling proto-RNA is similar enough to RNA that it could have been modified into RNA polymers on the prebiotic Earth. This is pure fantasy, since proto-RNA has no information-bearing capacity, and chemically it is doubtful that proto-RNA could have been changed into RNA molecules. John Sutherland of Cambridge University is highly critical of proto-RNA and has this to say: "To me, the proto-RNA idea raises more questions than it answers. It is too difficult for RNA to assemble chemically. How can a primitive biology invent RNA?" In their video, "What Was the Miller-Urey Experiment?" Stated Clearly rehashes old 1950s science that is largely seen as irrelevant to origin of life studies today. Most scientists today that study the atmosphere of the early Earth agreed that the specific mixture of gases used by Miller in his experiment are not what would have been present on the early Earth when life arose. In their video, "What is the RNA World Hypothesis?" Stated Clearly simply assumes that RNA nucleotides could be easily formed on the prebiotic Earth. This is definitely not the case. In fact, even the formation of the sugar ribose, which is one part of the chemical backbone of the RNA molecule, is a huge problem for origin of life researchers. It would have been impossible to form ribose on the prebiotic Earth because of the highly controlled environments in the lab that are necessary for its synthesis, and the fact that the conditions needed to produce ribose are also produce other kinds of sugar molecules that would remain in any prebiotic scenario and would interfere with the formation of ribonucleotides needed for the RNA formation. James Tour has looked at the chemistry needed to form ribose and has identified two just-in-time scenarios where the right chemicals have to be introduced at the right time for the desired reaction to occur. Also, he has identified 5 careful control steps modifying temperature and pH at certain times during the reaction sequence. All of these problems require the intervention of humans with a high degree of technical knowledge in order to produce ribose in the lab. Tour sums up these difficulties by saying, "From the data, the synthetic chemist can easily deduce that under prebiotic conditions, the reaction in question is not likely to yield anything useful. With each step added, difficulties are compounded by improbabilities so overwhelming that no other field of science would depend on such levels of faith." The problems with origin of life research have been acknowledged by Richard Dawkins and James Tour, who are looking at the problem from 2 totally different philosophical perspectives. For Stated Clearly to make videos that overstate the current state of origin of life research shows that they are not truly interested in promoting critical thinking, but rather they are promoting questionable science that can only be justified by appealing to highly subjective philosophical conclusions.